Good day, everyone. Hope you're having a great day. Today, we'll explore a quiet but powerful turning point between two brothers when Hung chooses love over a secure future, and James proves that blood is stronger than any company or conflict. What happens when asking for help doesn't lead to judgment, but unconditional support instead? Stay with us to see how one simple decision and one stone house becomes the foundation for a brand new beginning. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter of this story. Hung didn't come to James in a dramatic way. There was no argument, no raised voices, no long build-up. It was just a quiet meeting, the kind where both people already know something important is about to be said. They sat facing each other in a calm, almost empty space, away from the noise of work, away from family, away from expectations. Hung looked tired, not physically exhausted, but worn down in a way that comes from carrying too much responsibility for too long. He didn't start with excuses. He didn't blame anyone. He went straight to the point. Hung told James that he had left the company. He explained that after arguing with Mr. Huan, he made the decision to walk away, choosing to live with Tieu Ca instead of following the path that had already been laid out for him. It wasn't an impulsive move, he said. It was a choice he knew would cost him everything he had built professionally, and now that cost was very real. No job, no stable income, no proper place to live. Still, Hung didn't complain. He didn't ask for sympathy. What he asked for was simple and incredibly difficult at the same time. He asked James for help, not a handout, not pity, just help, so he could stand on his feet again. James listened without interrupting. He didn't lean back or cross his arms. He stayed present, focused, letting Hung finish every sentence. He could hear the pressure behind Hung's calm tone, the effort it took for his younger brother to ask for support without losing his pride. James understood that this conversation wasn't easy for Hung, and he respected that. When Hung finally stopped talking, the room went quiet for a moment. Not an awkward silence, but a pause, the kind that lets words settle. James didn't hesitate. He told Hung that he would help him. No questions asked, no conditions attached. He didn't ask why the argument with Mr. Huan escalated. He didn't lecture Hung about responsibility or consequences. He didn't criticize his choice to leave the company. Instead, James spoke calmly and clearly, as if the decision had already been made in his mind long before this conversation ever happened. "You're my brother," James said. "That's all I need to know." James explained that no matter what happened between Hung and Mr. Huan, no matter what choices Hung made for his own life, he wasn't going to stand by and watch his brother struggle alone. Family, to him, came before pride, before business, before any disagreement that could be fixed or forgiven later. Hung looked surprised. He had expected hesitation. He had prepared himself to explain more, to defend his choices, maybe even to be told, "I'll think about it." But none of that came. James's response was steady and certain, and that certainty caught Hung off guard. James continued, saying that life doesn't always follow the plans set by parents or companies. Sometimes people have to choose what feels right, even when it's harder. And when that choice leads to a difficult road, that's when family should step in, not step away. Then James shifted the conversation. He told Hung that he had a stone house, a solid, simple place that he wasn't using as his main home anymore. He said he wanted Hung to stay there, not temporarily, but properly, long-term. A real place to live, a place where Hung and Tieu Ca could start over without constantly worrying about the next step. Hung froze for a second. He hadn't expected that. Help, in his mind, meant advice, maybe a connection, maybe time to figure things out. But this was something much bigger. James made it clear that this wasn't charity. It wasn't about saving face or controlling Hung's future. It was about giving him stability so he could rebuild on his own terms. "This isn't a favor," James said. "It's what an older brother does." Hung didn't respond right away. His mind was racing, trying to process the weight of what James was offering. He felt gratitude, of course, but also discomfort. Accepting something so big challenged his sense of independence. Still, before he could say anything, James told him not to rush his answer. There was no pressure. The offer wasn't going anywhere. Later, James talked to Tieu Diep about his decision. He didn't ask for permission, but he wanted her to know. He explained Hung's situation honestly, without exaggeration, without softening the reality. He told her why he felt responsible, not out of obligation, but out of love. Tieu Diep listened carefully. She didn't interrupt or question his judgment. She already understood the kind of man James was. She knew that when he decided something like this, it came from a deep sense of family, not impulse. She agreed immediately. Tieu Diep said that she respected Hung's choice to stand by Tieu Ca, even when it meant walking away from comfort and security. She believed that helping him now wasn't just kindness. It was the right thing to do. More than that, she trusted James completely. If he believed this was the right move, then she stood with him. That support strengthened James's resolve. There was no doubt left, no second thoughts. Everything felt aligned. Not long after, James arranged a meeting with Hung again, this time with Tieu Diep present. The atmosphere was calm, serious but warm. James spoke clearly, explaining that the stone house would officially belong to Hung. He handed over the necessary papers, making it clear that this wasn't a temporary arrangement or something that could be taken back later. "This is your place," James said. "You don't owe me anything." Hung's hands trembled slightly as he held the documents. The reality of the moment finally hit him. This wasn't just help. This was trust. This was family choosing him without hesitation. Hung tried to speak, but his voice caught. He struggled to find the right words, eventually managing a quiet thank you. He admitted that leaving the company had been the hardest decision he'd ever made, but he promised that he wouldn't waste this chance. He would rebuild, not just for himself, but for the people who believed in him. Tieu Ca stood beside him the entire time, her hand tightly holding his. She didn't say much, but her eyes said everything. Gratitude, relief, and a deep appreciation for the kind of family Hung came from. James stepped closer and placed a hand on Hung's shoulder. He reminded him that this wasn't about debt or repayment. Brothers don't keep score. They show up when it matters. As the meeting ended, there was no dramatic farewell, just a shared understanding that something important had changed. Hung and Tieu Ca stood in front of the stone house later that day, looking at it quietly. It wasn't just walls and stone, it was a fresh start, a place built not on obligation, but on unconditional support. And for the first time in a long while, Hung felt something close to peace. Standing in front of the stone house, Hung felt a strange mix of emotions settle in his chest. The place wasn't grand, it wasn't flashy, but it felt solid, steady, like it had been waiting for someone who truly needed it. Tieu Ca stood beside him, quietly taking it all in. Neither of them rushed to speak. Some moments don't need words. When they finally stepped inside, the house felt cool and calm. The stone walls carried a sense of permanence, of something that wouldn't disappear overnight. Hung walked slowly through each room, imagining what life here could look like. A simple routine. Mornings without panic, evenings without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on his shoulders. For Tieu Ca, this house meant safety. It meant not having to constantly worry about where they would go next. She began opening windows, letting fresh air in, already thinking about how to make the place feel like home. Small things, curtains, a table, a corner where they could sit together after long days. Later that evening, James and Tu Diep stopped by briefly, not to supervise, not to give instructions, just to check in. James didn't walk through the house like it still belonged to him. He stayed near the doorway, letting Hung lead. That subtle distance meant everything. Hung thanked James again, this time with more steadiness in his voice. He told him he planned to start looking for work immediately. Not just any job, but something he could build from, something honest. James nodded, not surprised. He had expected nothing less. James reminded Hung that rebuilding takes time. There was no deadline, no pressure to prove anything overnight. The stone house wasn't a ticking clock. It was a foundation. Hung could take his time, learn, stumble if needed, and stand back up. Tu Diep added quietly that if they needed anything at all, they should say it. Not because they were being watched, but because that's what family does. She didn't frame it as help. She framed it as connection. After they left, the house felt even quieter, but not empty. Hung and Tieu Ca sat on the floor, sharing simple food, talking about practical things, what needed fixing, what could wait, how to budget carefully. These weren't glamorous conversations, but they felt grounding, real. In the days that followed, Hung fell into a new rhythm. Mornings started early. He updated his resume, reached out to old contacts, explored opportunities outside the world he had just left. For the first time, his identity wasn't tied to a company or a title given by someone else. That was terrifying, but also freeing. Some days were harder than others. Rejection emails came in, silence followed applications. Doubt crept in late at night when the house was too quiet, but every time Hung felt himself slipping, he remembered the way James had answered him without hesitation. That memory alone gave him strength. Tieu Ca played a quiet but crucial role in this transition. She didn't push him or rush him. She listened. She reminded him that choosing love over approval wasn't a mistake. It was a value. And values, even when costly, shape a life worth living. Meanwhile, James kept his distance, intentionally. He didn't call every day. He didn't check progress. He trusted Hung to find his way. That trust was another kind of gift. It said, "I believe in you," without ever needing to say the words. There were moments when the weight of Mr. Hwan's absence still lingered. The unresolved tension, the unspoken disappointment. Hung didn't pretend it didn't hurt, but he also knew that choosing his own life didn't mean abandoning family forever. Some bridges take time to rebuild, others need space before they can even be approached again. One evening, weeks later, Hung invited James and Tu Diep over for a simple meal. The house looked different now, warmer, lived in. Small details showed care and intention. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. As they sat together, the conversation flowed easily. No one brought up the past directly. There was no need. The present spoke loudly enough. James noticed the change in Hung. Not just stability, but clarity. His brother looked lighter, more grounded, more himself. At one point, Hung raised a glass and thanked James again, not just for the house, but for believing in him when things were uncertain. James brushed it off casually, saying it was nothing, but everyone at the table knew it wasn't nothing. It was everything. James reminded Hung that family isn't about control or expectations. It's about being there when someone makes a hard choice and still chooses to stand beside them. He said that disagreements fade, companies change, but blood and loyalty last. As the night wound down, James and Tu Diep prepared to leave. At the door, James paused and looked back at the house one more time, not with regret, with satisfaction. The stone house had found its purpose. After they left, Hung and Tieu Ca stood together in the quiet again. This time the silence felt full. They talked about the future, not in big, dramatic plans, but in small, steady steps. A job lead here, a skill to learn there, A life built slowly, honestly. The stone house became more than shelter, it became a symbol. Not of charity, not of sacrifice, but of unconditional family support. A reminder that sometimes the strongest foundations aren't built with money or success, but with trust and love. Hung knew his journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, conversations yet to happen with Mr. Huan. But for now, he had ground beneath his feet, he had a place to return to, and he had the quiet confidence that came from knowing he wasn't alone. In the end, James didn't just give Hung a house, he gave him time, space, and the freedom to rebuild his life without fear. And that, more than anything, was what made all the difference. This story follows Hung after he leaves the company to live with Tieu Ca, choosing love over approval and facing unemployment and instability. Swallowing his pride, Hung asks his older brother James for help. James responds without hesitation, placing family above conflict and offering Hung his stone house as a long-term home without conditions. With Tu Diep's full support, the decision becomes a turning point rather than a sacrifice. The stone house gives Hung and Tieu Ca stability, time, and space to rebuild their lives at their own pace. As Hung searches for work and redefines himself outside the company, James steps back, trusting his brother to stand on his own. The story highlights quiet loyalty, unconditional support, and the idea that true family is shown through action, not control, creating a calm yet powerful new beginning for everyone involved.